I'm Craig from Arborgreen. Keen to introduce Dr. Uwe Stroeher again. A lot of you guys have probably seen the last webinar, the last couple of ones. He's the head of research and development at NUTROG, and he's bringing us a great presentation today on how lawns are like icebergs. May as well get stuck into it. So, Dr. Uwe, how are lawns like icebergs?
Hello, and thank you very much for allowing me to give this presentation. You'd be surprised how lawns are a lot like icebergs because, you know, what we see above the ground doesn't really truly represent what happens under the ground. So, and often by the time you see a problem, you know, your lawn is dying or you've got spots in it or it's just generally sick, the damage has been done to the root system. So, you know, it's really what you don't see is what sinks you. So, yeah, your lawns and your turfs are under stress all the time, you know, whether it's, you know, your kids deciding to play cricket on it or somebody's mixed up the wrong concentration of herbicides, which you can see in the central picture there. You've got things like a thatch buildup, which is obviously a problem for a whole range of issues. You can't get water into the soil, you can't get nutrients in, and thatch really presents a bit of a problem because it traps moisture and it really encourages fungal diseases. You've obviously got things like, you know, extreme drying events, which are not so much of an issue at the moment, but, you know, in 3 or 4 months' time, everybody will be complaining about how dry their lawn is and how they can't get water in. And then, you know, on the other side of that coin is your waterlogging events, which really are more a problem, at least for us here in South Australia in summer. But if I sort of look at the eastern states, you know, certainly waterlogging is likely to be a problem again. So I'd like to address those issues as we go through this talk. Definitely. Now, I generally like to talk about soil microbiology and
sorry, I just wanted to mention that if you do have any questions, please pop those in the Q&A field and we'll either answer those at the end or throughout. So please don't be shy, pop in any questions you have. And sorry, Dr. Uwe, I'll leave you to it. It's okay.
So in essence, I like to sort of look at the health of a soil as a bit of a triangle with 3 interdependent, interplaying regions. So there's your soil biology, which is the microbial activity and your biomass and your organic carbon, and how much nitrogen can you fix and how available can you make those nutrients. And that's really the critical aspect from our perspective for this talk. But, you know, the other aspects are things like your soil structure, your friability, your water holding capacity, and especially for lawns, you're looking at issues like compaction as a major problem. And then there's your soil chemistry, your pH, and how is that affecting your availability of nutrients. So today I really want to concentrate a little bit about the soil bacteria and the soil fungi. I won't talk so much about the protozoa. Just to start off with, I should probably point out that lawns and turfs tend to be dominated by a bacterial microbiota. Whereas in my previous talk on trees and shrubs, that tends to be dominated by fungi. But that's not to say that these things are mutually exclusive. There are a range of fungi that also help soils, as there are a range of bacteria that help trees and shrubs. So let's talk a little bit about fungi to start with. Now, fungi are really important in order to allow your plants to reach nutrients that it may not be able to reach just by using the root hair. So if you have a look at that picture there, on the left-hand side, you'll see there's a root with some root hairs coming out of the sides. Now there's a dotted zone there. We call that the depletion zone. And within that zone, the plant has ready access to nutrients. But once you're outside of that zone, there really is no way for a plant to be able to obtain nutrients. And that becomes a particular problem for nutrients such as phosphate, which are extremely insoluble in the soil. So wherever you put your phosphate down, that's pretty much where it stays. It doesn't tend to move through the soil, unlike, say, nitrates or sulfates. Now, when your plant has a fungal partner, or even if it doesn't, even if there's generally fungi in the soil, they are often capable of solubilizing phosphate, as are many bacteria. And what that means is now that instead of the phosphate being trapped outside of where the plant has access to it, the plant can now actually grab phosphate from outside of the depletion zone. So it can do that in 2 ways. One is obviously with these fungal hyphae that increase the reach, and the other way is by microbes making phosphate more soluble. And I'll talk about that in a minute. One of the other things that fungi do, and this is particular interesting for lawns is that fungi can actually help your lawn overcome nematodes. Now, nematodes can be beneficial, but a lot of them do damage. And I'll show you a little video here. And what you'll see in the center is you'll see these little nematodes wiggling about. You'll also see that some of them will lay eggs, and those eggs will hatch and small nematodes will come out. Now, you'll see these lines that run through that almost look a bit like a sort of a spider web type scenario. That's your fungal hyphae, and what they're doing is they're trapping these nematodes, and over time they're digesting the nematodes. And the reason they do this is that these fungi look upon these nematodes as being a little source of protein, and a little source of protein is really just a source of nitrogen. So over time, as you see in this video, the nematodes pretty much get completely digested. And so what happens here is that the fungi give you protection against nematodes. Now, if you put a lot of artificial sort of chemical nitrogen on your soil, so if you're using a lot of urea and other very highly soluble forms of nitrogen, then the fungi doesn't actually switch this system on. It kind of says, well, if you're going to deliver me all the nitrogen I need in a readily available form, I'm not going to go to the trouble of digesting away nematodes. So just be a little careful when you're applying nitrogen, and that you can actually make a nematode problem worse because you're switching off one of the natural killing systems in the soil. So, you know, there's a lot of other benefits, and because this talk has been a little bit restricted to lawns and turf, so I won't go through everything, but obviously there is things like the ability to fix nitrogen, which we all know about from legumes. You've probably all had lawns where you've had the clover in the lawn. A lot of people don't like clover in their lawn or in their turf, but you'll often see that around that clover, the lawn will be quite nice and green. And that's because the clover has trapped a lot of nitrogen, which as it dies back, it releases back to the lawn in general. So, you know, you may not want to grow a clover crop, or you may not want to grow a legume crop in the middle of your lawn. That makes perfect sense. But there are a range of free living microbes that also help to fix nitrogen. Then there's the ability to do things like solubilize potassium that we already spoke about, and various other nutrients. One thing that a lot of people don't think about is carbon dioxide as a limiting nutrient for plants. We quite clearly see that some plants or some grasses, especially some of the warmer grasses like the couch and the buffaloes, they tend to respond really well to high levels of CO2. So we can clearly see we're currently in the world, we have about 400 parts per million of CO2. You quite clearly see that gives you a significant increase in growth. The cool climate grasses tend not to respond quite as vigorously to increased level of CO2, but nevertheless, they do respond. And so CO2 acts as a fertilizer. We know that from glasshouse experiments and the like. So when you're actually breaking down organic material, whether that's an organic fertilizer you're putting on your soil or on your lawn, or whether that's trying to break down the thatch, and I'll talk about that a bit later as well, what you're doing is you're releasing some carbon dioxide. Now, carbon dioxide obviously has that growth stimulating effect, but the other thing it does, it actually allows your plants to use less water. Now, I know that seems like a bit of a strange concept. How can CO2 allow your plants to use less water? Well, here you see a graph that sort of shows the level of CO2, and you can see that the amount of evaporation hasn't really changed, but the water use efficiency has gone up significantly. And the reason for that is that when your lawn has a high level of CO2 around it, the small stomatal pores found generally at the base of the leaves stay closed. When those pores are closed, then there's less water loss. Now, excuse me, when CO2 levels are low, the plant naturally wants to bring in more CO2 to grow during the day. And what it does, it opens up these stomatal pores. In that process of opening those pores, which you can see on the right-hand side, the plant loses a lot more water. So having a microbiologically active soil where CO2 leaves the soil and then surrounds your plants actually helps you to use less water. Some of the other things that microbes do, in particular bacteria, because we are talking about lawns here, so I'm not going to talk about the fungal aspect of this. They release a whole range of trapped nutrients. Perhaps the most well-known is phosphate. And you can see here's two agar plates. The plate on the right-hand side is the one with the potassium. The one on the left-hand side is the one with the phosphate. In the phosphate plate, you quite clearly see a clear zone around those colonies. So that opaque white material is insoluble phosphate. When these bacteria are present, they'll make that phosphate available by solubilizing it, so you get that clear zone, and that's now a phosphate that's available for plants. And similarly, on the right-hand side, you see a plate for potassium. The insoluble potassium, very similarly, is that sort of white material. And around those colonies that can solubilize potassium, you see this a clear zone. So again, what they're doing is they're releasing potassium. Now, in particular for phosphate, where phosphate is often bound up with things like calcium and the like, it also allows then the release of some calcium for your plants to grow, which is actually a very critical nutrient. A lot of people don't consider calcium and sulfur as being critical, but really in many ways they should be placed in almost the same position as potassium, phosphate, and nitrogen. Sorry, had a mental blank there. So lawns, personally speaking, I find lawns and turfs are some of the most difficult things to grow. And one of the reasons is that they're actually quite prone to a range of diseases. So if you have a look at here on the bottom there, you'll see quite a range of different fungi that cause diseases in lawns. And let me just sort of show you a bit of a picture. At Nutroc, we've been isolating lots and lots of soil microbes. And what we found is we found quite a few that actually have the ability to inhibit some of these pathogens. So if you have a look at that picture there on your left-hand side, the pathogen is on the top of the plate. It's that sort of white material. And where it says IA, that's really what we call a biological control agent. So what that's doing, it's controlling Pythium in your lawn. And just to give you an example, there's a large turf grower in New South Wales, Buchanan turf, and they actually order one of our products that we coat with 5 different microbes that inhibit Pythium. And every year they order exactly the same product. They order basically a crumbled sea mungus, which has been sprayed with these biocontrol agents in order to control Pythium in their lawn. The next central one you can see inhibits sclerotaria in your lawn, so the cause of dollar spot. And on the right-hand side, you basically see inhibition of fusarium or winter fusarium. So by having all these different microbes there, you can actually protect your lawn against many of these fungal diseases. Here's another example. This is basically what's called black dot, but it's also a lawn disease. Again, you can see quite clearly where the pathogen grows in the bottom half of the plate, and C1 is a really good inhibitor. And on the other side, you got rhizoctonia, again, a potential lawn pathogen. Again, we have an inhibitor for it. So if you think about it, what we have is we have a cocktail of inhibitors. In some cases, the same inhibitor might inhibit 2 or 3 diseases. In other cases, the inhibitor will be very specific to a single pathogen. But the whole idea is have a cocktail of these, and with that cocktail, we can treat a lot of these lawn diseases. Here's another example, basically, of a fusarium with an inhibitor at top and bottom. You can quite clearly see where the fusarium is growing, and it's sort of a butterfly effect where the wings of the butterfly are there, but above and below you see inhibition. One of the other things that microbes do in the soil is they produce all these plant growth factors. So you're probably familiar with things like auxins. So they're really designed for the microbes to use a signaling molecule. So they use that to talk to one another. But plants have been clever enough to use auxins and in effect hijack the ability of microbes to do that. So if you have microbes in the soil that produce auxins, for example, you'll get increased root development. Similarly, if you have microbes that produce cytokinins, you potentially end up with more above ground growth. So you end up with a larger number of shoots. And similarly with gibberellic acids. Now, gibberellic acids are perhaps a bit of a special class of plant growth hormones in that they alter the internodal length. So you end up with plants that have perhaps less leaves and more stems. So maybe not necessarily something that lawn people are interested in, but for other people, certainly gibberellic acids are one of the things that they're looking at to improve plant growth generally. So just to give you a bit of an idea, if you have a look here, on the top you'll see a range of different levels of auxins that are produced. So basically we isolate these bacteria, and then we in effect screen them for the ability to produce auxins. And we've screened a few for cytokinins and gibberellic acid. And if you have a look at that plant picture there on your left, you'll see quite clearly that with the ability to produce, to have these auxins, you get much better root development. And similarly with the picture, more or less in the center there, you'll see quite clearly that in the presence of auxins, there's a lot more root development than there is in the absence. So you can see how this might be important for not only growing a lawn that's already established, so getting more roots, getting roots to go deeper in the soil, but also when you're establishing a lawn or reseeding a lawn, or even if you're trying to renovate a lawn like, say, a cricket pitch or an oval. So thatch is perhaps the bane of most people that grow lawns, whether it's commercial growers, people looking after sporting fields, or even your home gardener. Thatch seems to be one of the things that people struggle with the most. And the problem is with thatch is, as I mentioned before, it does stop your soil from being as good as it can be. It stops the infiltration of things like water, fertilizer, and even air. And it forms really a little sort of micro environment close to the crown of your plants that really encourages a whole range of fungal pathogens. So we want to try to get rid of that thatch if we can. So one way to do that is to wet the thatch and to add a little bit of additional nitrogen. Often the thatch is actually caused by the inability to wet and the inability to get enough nitrogen on that thatch in order for the microbes to break it down. So there's a product that we're currently trialing, which is a cocktail of microbes designed to digest cellulose. And I'll show you a picture of that a little bit later. And also it has a spreading agent that really allows those microbes to spread across the whole surface of the thatch so that you can break it all down. And these are specific microbes that we've really sort of grown up in a high cellulose, or with a high cellulose diet, so to speak. So in the presence of things like straw and wood chips. A really good example recently is we had a school in Orange who have a number of cricket pitches, and they suffered from a whole range of different problems, including thatch, compaction, and waterlogging. And really what they did is they used an advanced formula of go-go juice, which is our biological probiotic for soils. And what they found was quite a remarkable difference. So the pitches bounced back. There was less thatch. The pitches recovered very quickly. And really, if you're looking at something like a cricket pitch where you do see a lot of wear and tear, to be able to bring those pitches back so that you can play maybe another game on the same pitch is a huge advantage, not only for schools, but obviously for professional sporting fields who are maybe using pitches. So they've decided that after their single trial, in fact, they've said, well, we don't need to trial this product any further. We're going to use it across all of our ovals. Very similarly, Buchanan turf have also used a product with these advanced microbes in it, and again they've seen quite significant improvement in growth in their lawns. And after one trial, they've now decided to do their entire farm with these biological applications in order to get a lusher lawn. So what they saw in effect was a lawn that was thicker, bounced back quicker, and it was just a better quality. And also when they rolled the lawn up for shipping, there was less breakage of the lawn, which obviously if you're a turf grower, it's pretty critical that those rolls of lawn actually arrive at the customer in a state that they can use it. So as I mentioned before, they did also use these biological control agents to control lawn diseases, in particular Pythium in their lawn. Now I spoke previously about the ability to solubilize potassium, and you can see that again on the plate on the left-hand side. The most left one can solubilize potassium, the one on the right-hand side can't. But I really want to point you towards that red plate, and that red plate, what it in effect does, it's a plate that contains cellulose. So what we do is we put cellulose into this agar plate, and then what we do is we grow the microbes on these plates. And when the microbe has the ability to digest the cellulose, you get an orange halo zone. So when we stain for the cellulose, we then see no staining or reduced staining where the cellulose has been broken down. You can see 3 out of those 4 microbes have done a really good job in breaking down cellulose. So the idea here is that this makes an ideal base for a product to, for example, reduce thatch in lawns, or for a farmer to reduce stubble in a field. So, there's lots of benefits that that soil microbes give you. Obviously, there are things that we haven't managed to discuss in this talk as yet. So one of the projects that we are looking at is drought and salinity stress tolerance, but there's a whole lot of things that we have spoken about, such as the ability to solubilize phosphate, the ability to basically inhibit things like fungi, and also to suppress diseases. I want to now talk a little bit about other substances that perhaps are biologicals, but are not living biologicals, if that makes sense. So one of the things that a lot of people are interested in nowadays are humic substances, or humates. And they really come about by the action of bacteria and fungi when they break down organic material. And all humic substances are really a mixture of molecules. So things like humic and fulvic acids are extracted from materials such as brown coal and peat. And what they do is they effectively extract that using hydroxide, and then it becomes soluble. And the soluble part of that material is then the humic and the fulvic acid. The insoluble portion becomes what are called humates. So humic acids are quite large, which means if you put them in the soil, they tend to hang around for quite a long time, but they are still soluble, so they will travel within the soil profile, and over time they do disappear. Whereas fulvic acids, being much smaller, basically disappear much quicker. Whereas the insoluble humics, so the human, tends to last a lot longer in the soil, many years to decades, because they're very, very large molecules. So we'll do a little bit of chemistry here, and I apologize for those people that maybe didn't want a chemistry course. But basically, humics really work because they have this ability to hold onto micronutrients. So essentially they're the leftovers after microbes have broken down the organic material, and they don't break down any further. And so it's, it's your lignins, it's your tannins, your lipids, your waxes, your fats, and those bacterial and fungal remains. One of the things that I will say is that when you do have biology breaking things down, often when you get hydrophobic soils, it is actually the leftover lipids, waxes, and fats from that breakdown that actually coat many of the soil particles and lead to that inability to wet your soil. And there are ways around that. You can break those things further down, as I mentioned earlier. So the humic substances, the reason they work is they have these things called carboxyl groups. It's just really that those red circle groups I've put on. That's basically a carbon, an oxygen, and an OH group. And what happens is that the hydrogen on that OH group, as you can see on the left-hand side, there's a picture of a carboxyl group, comes off very easily. And when that hydrogen comes off, it leaves behind a slight negative charge. And that negative charge now allows you to bind your cations. So you end up binding things like iron, manganese, zinc, and the like. So that's the way in which these humates actually reduce the loss of what most people call micronutrients. So, your manganese, your cobalts, your zincs, your irons, they all get captured by that humate and held there. And then they get released and recaptured. And during that release and recapture phase, during that release phase is when the plants can then grab those micronutrients for their own growth. So what we call that is they basically have a chelating effect in that they hold on to these. And the chelating effect is actually greatest in alkaline soils because they have a lower level of these hydrogen ions. So there's less competition between hydrogen binding back onto that carboxyl group versus, for example, something like in an acidic soil where there'd be a lot of hydrogen ions, there'd be a lot of competition. So if you're looking at things like organic carbon or carbon credits, the humates are considered to be part of that. And humus also has a great water holding capacity, and that becomes really important for sandy soils. And there is some reports that these humic substances are also have some growth hormones in them. In our products, we use liardenite from Victoria, and basically that's called a 50-million-year-old compost. And you'll find significant amounts of humates in things like the Seamungus pellets, and it's also found in some of the liquids in a go-go juice. So when you think about a pelletized product, you're probably not often thinking about the amount of humate that's in there, but there's 15% or so of humate in there. Now, if you think about that versus a liquid humate that you might put out, that might have 25 or 26% humates or humic acid, but overall you're probably putting out only 4 or 5 litres per hectare, whereas you might be putting out 150 grams or maybe even as much as 500 grams per hectare of a pellet. So you're actually getting much more humates than you do in your liquids. The other thing is seaweeds. A lot of people talk about seaweeds and how important they are and what role they play. And seaweeds certainly contain these micronutrients, but they're not a source of macronutrients. We have to remember that. And there's some slight benefit to heat and frost protection. There is obviously some plant growth promotion going on, and that's because seaweeds are rich in tryptophan, and tryptophan is one of the precursors for making one of the vital plant growth hormones, so in other words, auxins. They do increase your water holding capacity in your soil, but it only works with non-degraded seaweed, and that's because seaweed has in it these alginates. So when I talk about things like making agar plates, these growth medias, they're made from extracted agar or alginate that we put in. And we put in about 5 to 15 grams per litre, and that allows us to hold a litre of water. So they form a network, and within that network, you hold a lot of moisture. But like I said, it only works if the seaweed and the alginates haven't been broken down. There seems to be good evidence that there is increased disease resistance, most likely by triggering plants' defense system. So when you start to look at seaweed products, they come in 2 main versions. There's a liquid and there's a pellet. So the liquids tend to be chemically hydrolyzed. So basically what happens is they take the seaweed and they break it down in potassium hydroxide. Now, potassium hydroxide, I'm not sure if you're aware or not, is one of the most aggressive chemicals on the planet. And so what it does, it liquefies the seaweed and potentially also breaks these long chain alginate molecules. The other way to do this is to do it from a fermented or composted biological product, which is what we do for things like your Seamungus liquid and your go-go juice, and also for our pelletized Seamungus pellets. And in this case here, it's more a biological process and less a chemical process designed to break down the seaweed. So if we think about it, that the actual benefits of seaweed really go back to many, many years prior to liquid versions being available. And whether all the benefits are still present in chemically degraded seaweed is unknown. So liquids based on degraded by biological action, so brewing seaweed, probably results in more benefits being retained than if you just dissolve it in a very harsh chemical. So the other way of using seaweeds is to have them in a pelletized form or ground form, and that most closely resembles what was initially done. So initially people went out and actually collected seaweed from the shore, shredded it and used it as a mulch, and that's where most of the benefits have come from. And we can see that in that natural manner we can easily understand why we would see those benefits. So again, as I mentioned before, that ability to hold additional water is due to those alginates. Now, one of the other mechanisms is a lot of people talk about is seaweeds as an insurance policy for frost and heat stress. And this is also important for people that are growing turf or lawns or in sporting fields. Obviously, we're trying to reduce the level of heat and frost stress in your soil, on your plants, sorry. And what we think happens with seaweeds, and we're not 100% sure about this yet, is that it actually increases the water holding capacity within the leaf itself. So a plant's cells has a small central vacuole, which is filled with water in essence. It's like a little, think of it like a little rainwater tank. And seaweeds actually increase that water holding capacity by about 5%. Now that may not seem like a lot, but if you think about a small rainwater tank, and if you can increase that even slightly, it takes a little bit longer to warm up, takes a little bit longer to cool down. And so you get that mechanism of frost and drought protection, but it won't work in extreme conditions. So, you know, you might get frost protection to -2 or -3 degrees, but if you go down to -4, -5, you just cannot hold enough water within a leaf in order for it not to freeze completely. So you can't get that. So, you know, we need to be reasonable of what can be achieved in the way of insurance for heat and frost protection using seaweed products. Now, you know, as a rule, we ask so much of turf. I mean, people use it on sporting fields. People use it outdoors for a party. It gets stressed all the time. People park their car and wash it. One of the worst things you can possibly do. We expect it to grow in shade. We expect it to grow in full sun, hot, cold. So, you know, it's a plant that is subjected to enormous amounts of stress. Okay, and one of the things we have to remember is that when plants are stressed, and let's take things like, for example, drought stress or something similar, what actually happens is that the plants are stressed. We see that stress on the surface, but also the roots are stressed. The roots start to die back. The root hairs start to shrivel up. And what people then do is they think, oh, my lawn is stressed. I need to put fertilizer on it. They throw fertilizer on it. But the problem with stressed plants is that because they often have a damaged or reduced root system, they can't actually make use of those nutrients you put on. So the idea is you want to recover your lawn in a gentle manner. Okay, so if you think about it, a low level of nutrients in an organic form that is brought to the roots in a slow, controlled manner is much better than trying to recover a lawn by putting on harsh chemicals. You're literally asking to burn your lawn if you go down that route. So, you know, if you have heavy traffic areas, you know, rotate the areas, promote erosion, reduce your compaction, you know, remove plugs of material. So basically core your material, and that then will allow water and fertilizer back into your soil and will over time reduce your compaction. And one of the things I haven't talked about is the vital role that bacteria and fungi play in structure of your soil, and that can actually reduce the level of compaction your lawn suffers. So when you think about it, many lawns do get compacted, and one of the best ways to avoid that is by having active microbes. They stick soil particles together and they give your soil a lot more structure. Heat and drought is, again, low levels of organic material, and in sandy soils they tend to dry out and clays become rock hard, and that then ends up with reduced root penetrations, difficulty in getting water into the soil. So again, aerate your soil and use an organic fertilizer, something like your Seamunger's Crumble or your Blade Runner, so that you can get some organic matter into that soil. Because organic matter, no matter whether you have clay soils or sandy soils, will help you. I know that there, you know, if you're doing a golf course, people say, oh, I don't want to have any organic matter because I want it to drain all the time. But some organic matter is still vital, even in like a golf course. Waterlogging. It's obviously a major issue with clay soils. And again, low levels of organic matter mean that these soils collapse, the air spaces more or less completely disappear. And now these soils no longer have the ability to take up water. The water sits on the surface, and you end up with an anaerobic, smelly soil that results in roots dying back and roots. And then again, you see that on the surface very shortly after a waterlogging event. Your lawn starts to die, or your turf starts to die. Again, aeration and the use of a gentle organic fertilizer is the best way to go. Thatch, really you should remove it regularly. Now, either professional dethatching, or if you're a home gardener like myself, get a rake out and try to get some of the thatch up. But we are actually working on this product called Depth Charger. We've had some very good results with that product in the farming field, so in fields to reduce stubble. We've seen significant effects there. So the idea here is to actually reduce the thatch by breaking it down and returning that organic material to your soil, versus actually just wasting it or ripping it up and destroying it. And lastly but not leastly, and people here at Nutrol can testify to this, chemical spills. It happens. People make up the wrong concentration and they spray their lawn. They end up with all these dead patches. And what you need to do in this case is we can't ever bring dead lawn back. But what we can do is we can actually have microbiologically active soil that breaks these chemicals down. And so what happens is that you have a reduced retention time of the chemicals in the soil, and therefore you actually get much better and faster recovery from a chemical spill. So whether you've overused it or you've accidentally used the wrong herbicide, you thought you had something that was specific and it turns out it was broad. The only way to really bring that back quick is to water it in, and then also to make sure you've got that biological activity to break those chemicals down. Here's a bit of an example of what you can see. I mean, quite clearly this lawn has recovered remarkably by the addition of a biological inoculant here. So if you're using that, and I just point you to the two pictures, the middle one and the one on the right, you quite clearly see the patch where perhaps the biological inoculant was overused slightly. You can see it's quite clearly much greener and has come back much stronger. And that effectively only took about a week to 2 weeks to come from quite a diseased or a lawn with lots of dead patches to something that's quite lush. So it doesn't have to take long. It won't work overnight. So it's not like if you throw nitrogen on and 2 days later your lawn starts to look nice and green. This does take a little bit longer, but it is a biological way of doing it, and it is a much safer and in many ways a much more environmental friendly way of looking at it. So again, look, I thank you for your time, and please be aware that your lawn is like an iceberg. The majority of things that happen, the majority of what's important for your lawn actually takes place below the surface. So thank you for your time.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Dr. Uwe. That was great. And it does look like I've got a few questions here, if you've got a moment to answer some of those.
Sure, yep.
Perfect, one moment. The first one here is, what tests can be done to indicate biological activity in the soil?
Right, okay, so there's a couple of things you can do. And perhaps one of the ones is you can, if you're a professional grower, you can have a sample sent away and they will look at biological activity. So they'll measure the amount of CO2 released by your soil, and that's generally a pretty good indication of how microbiologically active your soil is. But one of the easiest way of doing it yourself is to actually just bury a piece of material, something like a linen or cotton, and just have a look. And it should only take probably about 8 weeks for that material to break down. If it takes much longer for that to break down, you probably don't have a biologically active soil. So, years ago there used to be this thing called take your old undies and bury them and pull them up a little bit later, and you'll see that if you've got a biologically active soil, they'll break down quite quickly. Now I don't necessarily condone people burying their underpants, but you can certainly get a strip of linen or cotton and bury it, and come back and maybe bury a few strips, and then come back every 4 weeks and have a look. And really after 8 weeks or so, it should be quite well degraded and broken down. That's really a good sign that you've got lots of biological activity.
Perfect. So there's definitely some options you can do yourself. And we've got another question here. What can be done to help hydrophobic soil? Right.
Okay. Yep. So obviously with hydrophobic soils, we got the option of adding wetting agents, and there's a plethora of those around, and they do work quite well. The problem with some of these wetting agents, they last only a short period of time. So as they get washed away, you're back to the same problem you had before. Really, what it is that if you have a sandy soil, and sandy soils tend to be the ones that are the most likely to experience that hydrophobicity. In sandy soils, only about 3% of all the soil particles need to be covered with a waxy coat, and the entire soil will become hydrophobic. Now, in clay soils, you need about 10% of the soil particle covered in order for it to become hydrophobic. So that already explains the difference on why, for example, a sandy soil will become hydrophobic and a clay soil may not. But one of the things you can do is you can actually add some organic material, and the other thing you can do is you can add a little bit of additional nitrogen. And what that then allows, it allows the microbes to break down some of those waxes and oils on the surface of soil particles, and that can overcome your hydrophobicity. But again, it is an issue, and it is a long-term issue. There are some products on the market that potentially work for longer term, but a lot of the sort of soil wetting agents don't work in the long term. So we have to be aware of that. Now, we are obviously developing a product that we want to be seen to be used, which is called Depth Charger, and that has a specialized surfactant in it that does last a long time, potentially years in the soil, and used together with these microbes, you can then break down some of those organic compounds, whether that's on the soil surface or actually in the thatch.
Perfect. No, definitely. And then it just looks like there's one last one. In the event of waterlogging, flooding or irrigation malfunction, how can you help the turf recover?
Yeah, that's a great question. To be honest, the only thing you can really do is to try to effectively drain the soil, and one way to do that is obviously by coring it. But again, that comes with its own problems, because as you're coring and walking on it, then those holes tend to collapse again if it's really badly waterlogged. It is difficult. Some people do go to the extreme and actually start cutting channels into their lawn to try to get some of that water away from the surface. It is more or less not so much about recovery, it's about ensuring that it doesn't happen the following year, and that's about being prepared, having that soil open and loose, having that organic matter that will allow drainage, because the biggest issue is really that once the structure of the soil collapses, then drainage becomes almost impossible. Literally, if you think about the soil, it's like a bit like a sponge, and once that sponge collapses down and becomes dense and all those air pockets are no longer there, then there's no way for water to infiltrate. So you're better off having a sponge that are full of air or full of water than a sponge that's been collapsed down where nothing can penetrate. So yeah, you do really need to look at it from the perspective of avoidance versus repair.
No, thank you. Doesn't look like there's any more questions, so we might be able to wrap this one up. Obviously, a huge thank you to yourself, Dr. Uwe. It's always informative and very educational. And then this wouldn't happen without the marketing teams. We've got the amazing Hazel, who's head of marketing at Nutrog. She helped put this together. And then we've got my marketing team, Mark and Liam, who sort of help with all of the behind the scenes work to make these things happen. So thank you very much, team.
Thank you.